Long before the names of kings became textbook material, before museum labels and guided tours and polished documentaries gave these places a neat frame, there were mornings when the pyramids stood in a harsher silence. Wind moved across open ground. Dust gathered in the seams between stones. Light arrived slowly over the edges of the desert, touching one face of a monument while the other still belonged to shadow. For the people who lived near these structures, a pyramid was not a wonder of the ancient world, it was part of the horizon. It was something built by human hands, block by block, season by season, under orders, under belief, under pressure, and under a kind of certainty that great works would hold the world together. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy calm history told this way, and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what hour it is where you are. I always like to picture these stories traveling quietly through different rooms, different cities, and different corners of the night, while the past waits for us in the dark. A pyramid can look permanent, and in one sense, it is. Stone survives in a way that flesh does not. A monument can outlive the language spoken around it, the rulers who ordered it, the workers who raised it, and the rituals performed in its shadow. Yet that is also where the first doubt enters. The building remains, but the society that made it does not remain in the same form. The shape endures. The order behind the shape can fade, crack, or vanish so slowly that later generations are left staring at the result, asking how a people capable of such discipline could lose their place in the world. When many people hear the word pyramid, they think, first, of Egypt. That is natural. The Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau have become the image most closely tied to the idea itself. Massive stone mountains with straight edges, geometric force, and a calm certainty that feels almost beyond ordinary life. Yet Egypt was not the only civilization to build pyramids. Ancient Nubia, to the south, in what is now Sudan, raised many more pyramids in number, though most were smaller and steeper. In Mesoamerica, the peoples of places like Teotihuacan, the Maya world, and later the Aztec world, built pyramid temples with stairs, platforms, rituals, and public meaning. Across different lands, different climates, and different belief systems, human beings kept returning to a similar form. They wanted height. They wanted order. They wanted a structure that could lift power, faith, memory, and authority above the ordinary world. That alone makes the subject more interesting than the simple image we inherit in school. A pyramid was not one invention with one meaning. It appeared again and again because it solved several problems at once. It was stable. It could be made larger over time. It could impress the living and honor the dead. It turned labor into a visible statement. It told everyone who saw it that this society could organize bodies, materials, and time on a scale far beyond the household or village. It also made belief solid. The invisible became visible. The ruler's claim, the god's power, the civilization's confidence, all of it took shape in stone. Even so, these structures did not rise from mystery. They rose from work. That can be easy to forget because the monuments feel almost too large for ordinary hands. Yet every block had to be quarried, moved, shaped, lifted, aligned, and set into place. Every worker had to be fed. Every crew had to be supervised. Every transport route had to remain open. Every tool had to be made and replaced. The pyramid was the end result of a much larger system. Fields producing grain, river traffic moving supplies, officials tracking labor, craftsmen repairing equipment, priests giving sacred meaning to the task, and rulers strong enough to command the effort without the whole arrangement falling apart. In Egypt, the age of the great pyramid builders belonged to the Old Kingdom, especially the Fourth Dynasty. The names that echo most clearly now are Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Their monuments were not experimental in the casual sense. They were the products of a civilization already capable of large-scale administration. Even so, the path toward the famous pyramids was not smooth. There were earlier royal tombs called mastabas, low rectangular structures with sloping sides. There was also trial and error. The step pyramid of Djoser, created under the architect Imhotep, began as one kind of tomb and rose in stacked stages into something that changed the visual language of royal burial. After that came attempts at true pyramids, including the bent pyramid, whose angle changes partway up, as if the structure itself remembers a correction made in mid-thought. These were not signs of failure so much as signs of learning under enormous pressure. That detail matters because it brings the builders closer to us. They were not magicians. They were planners, solving problems in real time. A monument that now feels timeless once belonged to a world full of choices, risks, and limits. Stone is heavy, heat is punishing, distances matter. A ruler may command, but command alone does not move a block across uneven ground. The civilization had to create a chain of cooperation strong enough to hold from quarry to final placement. When that chain worked, a pyramid rose. When that kind of chain weakened across the wider society, the consequences would reach far beyond architecture. For a long time, older popular stories imagined pyramid builders mainly as slaves driven under cruelty. That image remains powerful, but the evidence is more complex. At least in the case of Old Kingdom Egypt, many workers seem to have been organized laborers, some seasonal, some skilled, some supported by the state with food and housing. Archaeological remains near Giza suggest structured communities of workers and supervisors. There were teams with names. There were bakeries, storage areas, and evidence of planned provisioning. This does not turn the work into something gentle. It was still physically punishing, still connected to hierarchy, still commanded from above. Yet it tells us the project depended not merely on force, but on administration. A society capable of feeding and organizing thousands of laborers for a monumental task was a society with strong internal structure. Picture that world for a moment, not as a postcard, but as a daily rhythm. Boats moving on the Nile when the water allowed transport. Quarries ringing with the sound of pounding stone. Men hauling sledges, perhaps over wetted ground to reduce friction. Scribes making records with careful hands while dust settled on their skin. Foremen calling out instructions. Bread being baked in quantity that seems almost industrial for its time. Beer brewed not for leisure alone but as part of a worker's ration. Cattle slaughtered for crews of high importance. Copper tools blunted and sharpened again. Ropes frayed and replaced. Deadlines tied not to modern contracts but to royal expectation, religious purpose, and the ruler's own mortality. A pyramid, in that sense, was a race against time. The ruler wanted a secure future beyond death, and the state had to turn that desire into architecture before life ran out. That urgency gave the monument emotional weight. This was not merely a public building, it was a machine of eternity. The Egyptians did not think the tomb was decorative. They believed the survival of the king after death mattered to the order of the world itself. In their view, political power, sacred duty, and cosmic balance were deeply linked. A tomb for the ruler was bound to the larger logic of the state. Building it was practical labor inside a sacred frame. Nubia offers a different but connected story. south of Egypt, along the Nile corridor. The kingdom of Kush developed strong political and cultural traditions of its own. At sites such as El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe, Nubian rulers built pyramids that were narrower and steeper than the giant Egyptian examples at Giza. These monuments came later than the earliest Egyptian pyramids, and they belong to a civilization that interacted with Egypt in many ways, through trade, conflict, influence, imitation, rivalry, and periods of direct rule in both directions. There were times when Kushite rulers even controlled Egypt and formed its 25th dynasty. So when we speak of pyramid builders, we are not speaking about one isolated center radiating outward in a simple line. We are speaking about a region of contact and exchange where styles, beliefs, and royal symbols could travel, shift, and take new form. The Nubian pyramids are sometimes less famous in popular memory, yet that neglect adds another layer to the mystery. A civilization can leave many monuments and still become half invisible in later imagination. Kush was powerful. Its rulers commanded wealth, armies, trade routes, and sacred authority. Its burial landscape was full of pyramids, enough to show that the form remained politically useful and symbolically alive. Yet the broader modern public often gives Nubia only a passing glance, as if the stone survives more clearly than the people themselves. That, too, is part of what it means for a civilization to fade. It may not only lose power in its own time, it may lose attention in ours. Far from the Nile, Mesoamerican pyramids reveal that the shape did not belong to one religious idea alone. At Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon stood within a vast urban design, part of a city whose scale and planning still command respect. In Maya regions, stepped pyramids rose within ceremonial centers, tied to kingship, astronomy, ritual, and public performance. These were not tombs in exactly the same sense as the Egyptian royal pyramids. Many were temple platforms, places for ceremony, display, or sacred connection. Yet the broad lesson remains. Pyramid building signaled organized power. It required labor, planning, and social agreement strong enough to carry out work whose meaning exceeded any one person's lifespan. When you compare these civilizations, a pattern begins to show. Pyramids appear where hierarchy is strong, where rulers can mobilize labor, where religious or political ideas justify immense expenditure, and where enough agricultural stability exists to support workers not directly producing food. That last piece is crucial. Monument building rests on surplus. A society must produce more than the minimum needed for survival if it wants thousands of people to spend time cutting stone rather than planting crops. Surplus sounds abstract, but it is deeply physical. It means fields yielding enough grain. It means storage working well enough to carry one season into the next. It means transport routes functioning. It means administration keeping order. A pyramid is not only a monument to the dead or the divine, it is a monument to surplus held together successfully. Which brings us back to the first doubt. If pyramid building depends on such a delicate chain of conditions, then the monument is also evidence of vulnerability. What happens if crops fail? What happens if a river shifts, a climate changes, a dynasty weakens, regional governors pull power away from the center, or the cost of display grows larger than the confidence beneath it? What happens when the same system that made greatness possible becomes rigid, expensive, and difficult to sustain? In Egypt, that question appears not long after the great age of pyramid building. The enormous monuments of the Old Kingdom represent concentrated power at its peak, but peaks do not go on forever. Later periods saw changes in royal burial practices, changes in political arrangement, and episodes of fragmentation. The first intermediate period followed the Old Kingdom with weaker central authority and stronger regional power. The pyramids did not disappear overnight, and Egyptian civilization itself certainly did not vanish in a sudden dramatic way. Yet the age when kings could command projects on the scale of Giza belonged to a specific moment. Something about the structure of power had shifted. That shift matters because the monuments can fool the eye. Standing before a pyramid, it is easy to think in terms of permanence, but permanence belongs to the stone more than to the state. The state was living tissue. It needed food, obedience, belief, record-keeping, social peace, and environmental support. The stone stayed where it was placed. The human system had to renew itself constantly. When renewal slowed, the monument did not crack first. The wider civilization did. This is one reason the question of disappearance can be harder than it first seems. Civilizations do not always vanish like a lantern going out. More often, they thin, fragment, move, transform, or lose the conditions that once made them feel unshakable. A capital may weaken while villages continue. A dynasty may fall while a language survives. A religion may shift while old sacred sites remain visible but changed. The pyramid outlasts the administrative order that raised it, and later people inherit the shell of confidence without the living machinery that once filled it. Teotihuacan offers one of the most striking examples of this problem. It became one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with planned avenues, monumental architecture, and immense influence across central Mexico, yet its decline remains debated. Fire, internal unrest, changing trade, stress within the ruling order, and wider shifts in the region all appear in the discussion. The city was not erased from memory immediately. Later peoples looked back on it with awe, yet its original civic life ended. The monumental center remained. The organizing force behind it did not. Again, the shape endured after the system lost its grip. The same quiet pattern haunts the Maya world, though in a more dispersed and varied way. Many Maya cities rose to impressive heights of political and cultural sophistication, with stepped pyramids, carved monuments, writing, astronomy, and dynastic memory. Yet large centers in the southern lowlands experienced dramatic decline during what is often called the classic Maya collapse. Population shifts, environmental strain, warfare, political breakdown, and local variation all played roles. Some cities emptied, while others persisted. Some regions weakened, while northern zones later flourished. It was not one clean ending. It was a complicated rearrangement. Still, the emotional image remains powerful. Monumental sites standing in silence, while the dynasties that once filled them with voice and ceremony were gone. That image invites a dangerous temptation. It can make us want one elegant answer. People often prefer a single cause because it feels satisfying. Drought did it. Invasion did it. Disease did it. Rebellion did it. The truth is usually more layered. Great building cultures often decline not from one blow, but from several pressures pressing at once. Food security weakens. Trade changes. Rulers lose trust. Rival factions rise. Ritual obligations continue even as resources tighten. The old symbols remain important, which can make adaptations slower. A civilization may keep performing strength after strength has already begun to thin. That possibility gives the pyramids a slightly haunting quality, though not in a loud or theatrical way. They are statements of confidence built by societies that did not know their confidence had limits. Each block says, in effect, we are organized, we are stable, we are meant to endure. Yet history answers in a softer voice. Endurance is never simple. Stone can endure. A political world must earn its continuation again and again. There is another detail worth lingering over. Monument building does not merely reflect power. It can also consume it. A vast project draws in labor, food, materials, and attention. When a state is healthy, that cost may be manageable, even useful, because the project reinforces unity and sacred legitimacy. When the system begins to strain, the same project can become a burden or a memory of overreach. We do not always know the exact balance in each case, and we should be careful not to imagine every pyramid as a foolish expense. Many were central to the logic of their societies, yet the question remains valid. Could the very scale of these works become harder to sustain over time? Could monumental ambition outlive the conditions that first supported it? With Egypt, one can feel that tension in the changing forms of royal burial. The giant pyramid age gave way to different strategies, different tomb styles, different political realities. With Kush, the pyramid tradition persisted in its own way and under its own conditions, yet Kushite power also changed across centuries, facing pressure from trade shifts, rival forces, and long-term regional transformations. With Mesoamerican centers, monumental architecture often remained part of civic and sacred life, even as dynasties rose and fell around it. In every case, the monument appears as both triumph and clue. It shows what a civilization could do. It also reveals how much had to be in place for that doing to happen. So the first real layer of the mystery is not merely how these pyramids were built. That question matters, and it always will, because the labor itself still stirs the imagination. But the deeper question is, what kind of world can support such acts for generations, and what kind of change causes that world to loosen? When we admire a pyramid, we are looking at the visible tip of an invisible order. Fields, kitchens, workshops, scribal rooms, royal courts, priestly rituals, transport systems, and seasonal rhythms all stand behind the stone. The monument is the calm final face. Beneath it once lived a whole civilization breathing in coordination. And that is why the silence around many pyramid sites feels so heavy now. Not because the stones are mysterious in themselves, but because they point toward crowds we can no longer hear clearly. There were instructions shouted across work grounds. There were arguments, injuries, calculations, prayers, meals, punishments, rewards, hopes, and fears. There were people born into these systems who likely assumed the order around them was as lasting as the monuments rising before their eyes. They did not know that later generations would look back and speak of disappearance. Yet disappearance is rarely a single moment. It is more often a long fraying, hidden at first by routine. The bread still bakes, the officials still record, the ceremonies still happen. The monument still receives attention. Somewhere inside the system, though, strain begins to gather. It may gather in the soil, in the flood cycle, in the cost of feeding workers, in the ambitions of provincial elites, in unrest among subjects, or in the simple burden of maintaining a grand order over too wide a world. By the time the break becomes visible, the weakness may have been growing quietly for years. That is where the pyramids become more than architecture. They become a way of reading confidence against time. They show us civilizations at the height of their ability to command matter and meaning. They also force us to ask what daily life looked like behind the display, what made such concentration of effort possible, and what hidden fragility may already have existed within the very systems that seemed strongest. The answer does not lie in the stone alone, It lies in the people, the fields, the food, the labor, the gods, and the structures of obedience that once turned ambition into reality. And once we turn from the monument to the civilization breathing around it, the picture grows larger, richer, and much less certain. A pyramid can make an ancient civilization look almost superhuman from a distance. The lines are too clean, the scale too large, the survival too complete. It tempts the mind to think first about rulers, engineers, and impossible labor, as if the entire society existed only to produce stone. But no civilization lives inside its monuments alone. Behind every pyramid stood kitchens, storehouses, fields, workshops, river landings, sleeping quarters, religious routines, family obligations, taxes, arguments, repairs, and ordinary exhaustion. The stone was the visible crown of a much wider world. To understand why some pyramid-building civilizations later weakened or seemed to vanish, it helps to leave the summit for a while and spend time closer to the ground, where daily life actually held the whole structure up. Imagine a settlement tied to royal building activity along the Nile, not a place of wonder in the modern sense, but a place of duty. Before sunrise, movement begins. Grain that was stored, counted, and protected has to be ground into flour. Ovens must be heated, water must be carried. Meat, if available, must be prepared and rationed carefully. Tools from the day before need checking. Ropes, sledges, chisels, wooden supports, baskets, and carrying frames all require attention, because work on that scale is never only about effort. It is also about maintenance. A society does not move huge quantities of stone simply by being determined. It moves them by keeping 1,000 smaller tasks from failing. That is the first reality behind monumental building. It depends on repetition, not one dramatic act, but countless ordinary acts done in sequence. Someone must cut stone. Someone must guide transport. Someone must plan river movement when the season is right. Someone must track labor groups. Someone must shape food policy, because hungry workers slow down and resentment grows quickly. Someone must ensure storage does not spoil. Someone must replace tools that break. Someone must calm tensions between crews, or punish them, or reward them, because labor on a great project can harden into pride or turn sour into defiance, depending on how the system behaves. In Egypt, the Nile made this kind of organization possible in ways that are difficult to overstate. The river was not just water. It was timing, transport, fertility, rhythm, and expectation. When the flood came and receded, it left fertile soil that supported agriculture with remarkable consistency compared with harsher landscapes. That consistency gave the state something invaluable: predictability. Predictability meant grain could be collected, measured, and stored. Grain meant people could be fed. People who were fed could be organized for labor. Labor under authority could become a monument. The pyramid, then, was not standing apart from nature. It was resting on a very particular relationship between water, land, administration, and belief. For many farming households, life in such a civilization was likely shaped by both obligation and adaptation. The state needed crops, labor, and compliance. Families needed enough stability to survive from one season to the next. These needs could align for long stretches of time. During flood periods, when fields could not be worked in the usual way, labor may have been redirected towards state projects. This did not make the arrangement easy, but it made it imaginable. A government with reach, storage, and authority could mobilize labor seasonally and frame that labor not only as duty, but as participation in the sacred and political order. The king was not merely a ruler in the modern sense. In Egyptian thought, he was bound to cosmic order. Service to the state could therefore be understood not simply as obedience to a powerful man, but as support for the balance of the world itself. That kind of belief matters, because large civilizations are not held together by force alone. Force can compel for a while, but belief makes compulsion deeper. When people accept that the existing order is proper, necessary, or sacred, the state spends less energy fighting its own population and more energy directing it. Pyramids, therefore, belong to a world in which religion and administration reinforced each other. Priests, officials, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers did not all occupy equal rank, but their work was connected by shared assumptions about kingship, death, and continuity. The king's survival after death was not a private matter. It touched the stability of the kingdom. A royal tomb was not a luxury in the eyes of that system. It was part of maintaining order between the human world and the divine. This is one reason the monument tells only half the story. The other half is made of institutions. A society capable of pyramid building needed people who could count grain, allocate rations, plan transport, record workforce divisions, oversee quarrying, and maintain political discipline across distance. The scribe becomes more important here than modern imagination often allows. A stone block may seem more dramatic than a line of ink, yet without records, categories, and accounting, the whole system grows blind. Administration is quiet power. It does not announce itself like a monument, but it makes the monument possible. Alongside administration stood specialization. Great building cultures do not rely only on large numbers of workers. They rely on different kinds of workers. There are quarrymen, haulers, stone finishers, rope makers, boatmen, potters, bakers, brewers, carpenters, metal workers, physicians or healers of some kind, priests performing rituals, and overseers who must read the mood of the labor force while meeting the expectations of those above them. There are also skilled architects and planners, even if their precise titles and methods shifted over time. A pyramid, therefore, reveals a division of labor broad enough to support both daily survival and symbolic ambition. That is a sign of civilizational maturity. It is also a sign of complexity. And complexity is powerful only as long as it remains coordinated. The workers themselves deserve more attention than they usually receive. For centuries, the popular imagination flattened them into anonymous bodies, but archaeology has pushed back against that image. Worker settlements and burials near major Egyptian sites suggest that crews had structure, identity, and varying status. Some workers were more skilled than others. Some may have served seasonally. Some likely belonged to labor teams with names that carried pride and rivalry. The existence of organized housing, food production, and medical care of a practical sort suggests not a chaos of expendable bodies, but a managed labor environment. This does not turn the system into fairness. It remains hierarchical, demanding, and often severe. Yet it shows that pyramid building depended on preserving enough worker capacity to keep the machine running. You can sense the social logic in the food alone. Bread and beer were staples, not luxuries. They fueled labor. Meat, onions, fish, and other provisions mattered not only nutritionally but politically. Better-fed crews worked better, but they also signaled state capacity. A ruling power that cannot feed its labor force begins to advertise weakness. When rations fall, morale falls with them. Grievance enters. Productivity drops. Discipline becomes more expensive. Under those conditions, even a sacred project can begin to feel heavy in the wrong way. The same principle appears in housing. However modest worker quarters may have been, their existence within a planned environment mattered. A labor force scattered without order is harder to direct. Housing near work sites means the state is arranging not just effort, but space itself. It reduces unpredictability. It keeps labor visible. It ties everyday existence more tightly to the project. These were not separate worlds, one sacred and one ordinary. They were fused. The worker's meal, the scribe's tally, the overseer's command, and the priest's ritual all belonged to the same larger order. Yet, even in a strong order, not everyone experienced civilization the same way. The pyramid reflects central power. It does not automatically reveal local feeling. A provincial farmer may have respected the king, feared taxation, accepted religious duty, and resented administrative burdens all at once. Human beings are rarely simple carriers of ideology. They adapt, endure, complain, obey, negotiate, and sometimes resist. A civilization can look unified from above while remaining full of local pressures below. That tension is important because great states often appear strongest when their symbols are most complete, even if discontent or strain has already begun to gather in less visible places. In Nubia, where the kingdom of Kush developed its own pyramid tradition, daily life was shaped by a different but connected landscape. The Nile remained crucial, yet the political and ecological setting was not identical to that of Egypt. Kush controlled trade routes, drew wealth from regional exchange, and developed centers of power that balanced local traditions with influences absorbed and transformed from Egypt. This is important. Nubian civilization was not a pale imitation standing south of a supposedly original center. It was a creative power in its own right, able to adopt forms like pyramids, while using them within its own political and cultural logic. The Kushite world likely felt, in daily terms, like a meeting place of river life, royal authority, sacred practice, and broader movement across the African interior. Trade carried goods, ideas, and prestige. Elites expressed power through burial architecture and royal symbolism. Communities around these systems would have included herders, farmers, craftsmen, administrators, and ritual specialists. The pyramid there again signaled organized rule, but it also reflected participation in a larger network of identity. To build such monuments over generations required continuity of leadership, control of resources, and enough legitimacy to sustain the effort. That makes the later fading of Kushite prominence more revealing. It suggests not the collapse of one building method, but the weakening of the economic and political world that made those monuments meaningful. Mesoamerica shows the same lesson from another angle. There, pyramids rose within cities that were often dense, ceremonial, and highly structured. At Teotihuacan, urban planning itself became monumental. Broad avenues, massive platforms, residential compounds, ritual spaces, and carefully ordered architecture suggest a society able to coordinate labor and shared symbolic life on a huge scale. Daily existence in such a city would have felt deeply social. Crowded neighborhoods, workshops, markets, ritual events, administrative routines, and class distinctions all pressed close together. Monument building there did not stand at the edge of life. It stood in the middle of it. The same is true for many Maya centers, though the political pattern was often more fragmented across city-states. In a Maya city, pyramid temples were tied to ritual time, dynastic display, public ceremony, and the visible staging of sacred kingship. To climb those stairs, to gather in plazas below, to watch rulers perform ceremonies or witness the marking of dates and victories, was to live inside a built language of power. The city was not merely inhabited, It was interpreted. Architecture instructed people how to see authority. A stepped pyramid was part of that instruction. It told viewers where the sacred stood, where the ruler stood, and where the ordinary body belonged in relation to both. Again, though, a monument is never self-sustaining. It rests on food. The more impressive the ceremonial center, the more vulnerable the society becomes to disruptions in the systems beneath it. Farming, water control, trade, tribute, and political cooperation all have to continue. In the Maya world, agriculture could be highly productive, but it often operated within ecologically demanding conditions. Forest clearing, soil pressure, water storage, and rainfall patterns all mattered. When things were going well, cities could flourish in astonishing ways. When several pressures began to overlap, the same sophistication could become fragile. This is where daily life becomes one of the great clues to later decline. Civilizations usually do not fail first at the level of their highest symbols. They fail first in the routines that feed those symbols. A worker receives less grain. A local official pockets more than he should. Flood patterns become less reliable. Roads or waterways become harder to secure. A ruler demands grandeur to display power at exactly the moment when the real base of power is thinning. Local elites begin to think more in terms of their own advantage than collective order. Families notice shortages before inscriptions do. By the time a capital or ceremonial center visibly weakens, private life may have been carrying warning signs for years. One can think of a pyramid as a frozen summary of confidence. It says the civilization believed tomorrow would resemble the structure of today closely enough to justify immense effort. That belief can last a long time. It can also become dangerous if tomorrow begins to change. Large systems are often slow to admit weakness because their whole legitimacy depends on the appearance of order. A kingdom cannot easily tell its subjects that resources are strained, that harvests are uncertain, that regional power is slipping, or that the old formulas no longer work. It is more likely to continue performing strength, to continue funding rituals, monuments, and royal display, because those things are the language through which it understands itself. But performance cannot feed a labor force forever. There is also the question of generations. A civilization that builds pyramids is not acting through one ruler alone. It is transmitting habits and expectations across time. Children grow up seeing monuments already standing and projects already underway. They inherit assumptions about who commands, what the gods require, what kind of labor is proper, and what greatness looks like. This inheritance gives a state stability. It also gives it inertia. If old patterns become less workable, people raised inside them may adapt slowly. The very success of the system can make new realities harder to face. Religious life strengthened that continuity. In Egypt, temple rituals, funerary practices, offerings, festivals, and sacred calendars stitched everyday reality to cosmic meaning. In Mesoamerica, ritual timing, public ceremonies, ancestor memory, sacred kingship, and astronomical alignment carried similar weight, though in very different forms. In Kush, royal burial and sacred authority also joined political rule to spiritual legitimacy. Such systems did more than comfort the population. They organized time. They made history feel patterned. They help societies interpret hardship within a meaningful frame. That can be stabilizing. It can also make structural problems easier to endure without solving them. Consider the household within such a world. Most people were not architects of monuments. They were farmers, artisans, servants, porters, traders, relatives, parents, children, widows, elders, apprentices. Their days were governed by work, hunger, weather, duty, and hope. They may have seen the pyramid not as a puzzle, but as a fact of order. A ruler dies, a tomb must be built. A god must be honored. A ceremony must be carried out. The state demands service. Service is given. From inside the civilization, much of what looks extraordinary to us may have felt normal enough to bear. That normality is easy to underestimate. People can sustain immense systems when those systems are woven into ordinary expectation. At the same time, ordinary expectation has limits. If harvests shrink, if taxation hardens, if labor obligations bite too deeply into household survival, if warfare increases, if rulers demand too much while giving less security in return, then the emotional balance changes. Loyalty becomes thinner. Belief may persist, but confidence in institutions can weaken. Families start adjusting for themselves. Local powers become more important than distant capitals. Migration becomes thinkable. The civilization still exists, but it becomes less coherent from within. That is why archaeology pays so much attention not only to monuments, but to middens, food remains, pottery styles, house sizes, burials, road networks, workshops, and storage patterns. These smaller traces can show the health of a society more honestly than its grand structures can. A palace inscription may praise abundance. Animal bones, grain remains, and settlement shifts may tell a harder story. The ordinary leaves evidence too, and often it reveals the first signs that the wider order was no longer distributing stability in the old way. In Teotihuacan, for example, the city's greatness rested on a wide social base that included not only elites, but extensive residential compounds and networks of production and exchange. Obsidian working, trade connections, ritual authority, and urban planning all supported the city's role. Life there must have been shaped by crowding, coordination, and constant symbolic presence. But a city that large also required constant management. Water, food inflow, internal order, and ideological coherence had to be maintained. If political trust fractured, or if competing groups saw advantage in weakening the center, the daily basis of unity could unravel quickly, even while the Great Pyramids still dominated the skyline. Maya cities reveal similar pressures in different forms. Royal courts, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, traders, and ritual specialists together created urban worlds that were both artistically rich and politically demanding. Monumental construction celebrated dynasties, victories, and sacred cycles, but it also required tribute and labor. In periods of stress, dynastic rivalry could intensify rather than ease. Warfare could become more disruptive. Agricultural systems could come under greater strain. Households at the edge of survival would feel these pressures in immediate ways. Their response might be subtle at first: movement to another zone, reduced support for elite projects, altered local loyalties, or simple demographic thinning. The monumental center would remain, but its living human field would begin to loosen. This helps answer an important question. Why do so many vanished civilizations seem to leave behind such complete architecture? Because architecture is not the most fragile part of civilization. The most fragile part is coordinated daily life. Once enough people stop showing up in the same way, for the same obligations, under the same accepted authority, the society has already changed profoundly, even if the monuments still stand exactly where they stood yesterday. Stone gives the illusion that continuity lasted longer than it really did. There is another layer still. Great projects can create social meaning beyond obedience. Workers may have felt pride. Communities may have gained identity through participation. Skilled laborers may have enjoyed status. Ritual activity around pyramids could bind a population emotionally to the center. It would be wrong to imagine all monument building as pure suffering under abstraction. Human beings often invest their labor with meaning, especially when surrounded by ceremony, tradition, and visible achievement. That meaning is part of what makes large systems durable. Yet it is also part of what makes their decline painful. When a civilization begins to weaken, it does not only lose administration, it loses shared confidence in what effort is for. The families living in the shadow of pyramids probably did not ask the modern question in modern terms. They were not sitting beside a wall at dusk wondering why their civilization would someday vanish. They were thinking about next season, next offering, next shipment, next command, next burial, next tax, next flood, next rain, next meal. And that is precisely the point. Civilizations are sustained through near-term life, even when they speak in eternal language. The monument says, forever. The people sustaining it are still governed by harvest cycles and fragile bodies. If too many of those bodies are pushed beyond what the system can renew, permanence begins to thin from the bottom upward. That is where the first signs of trouble often hide. Not in the top of a pyramid, but in the effort required to keep kitchens full, labor loyal, fields productive, and provincial officials obedient. A strong civilization can absorb setbacks. A civilization under accumulating pressure starts turning each setback into a multiplier. A poor harvest affects storage. Weak storage affects labor. Weak labor affects prestige. Loss of prestige affects political obedience. Reduced obedience makes extraction harder. Harder extraction worsens local suffering. The system begins to chase its own tail. And once that starts, monumental certainty can become a mask worn by a world that is tiring beneath it. So, when we ask why pyramid-building civilizations faded, we are also asking a quieter question. What was life like for the people whose ordinary routines held everything together? The answer is not romantic, and it is not simple. Their lives were structured by dependence on land, on water, on hierarchy, on inherited belief, and on institutions that translated surplus into visible power. They lived close to the practical mechanics of civilization even when sacred language wrapped those mechanics in grandeur. Their labor made the monuments rise. Their food sustained the crews. Their compliance fed the state. Their local endurance gave the center its confidence. And that is why the monuments remain so deceptive. They look like endings carved in stone, but they are really evidence of thousands of beginnings repeated every day. Bread baked, grain counted, boats loaded, tools repaired, prayers spoken, orders passed, children raised, wounds treated, debts measured, and seasons endured. Once enough of those beginnings become harder to repeat, the civilization changes long before its monuments fall. The stones stay high. The life beneath them starts to shift. At first, the change is almost too small to see. Then the old order begins to feel heavier than before, and the first true cracks are no longer hidden in the distance. The first signs of decline in a great civilization are often the easiest to miss. They do not always arrive as fire on the horizon or armies at the gates. More often they begin in things so ordinary that no one living through them would immediately call them the start of an ending. A harvest comes in lighter than expected. A storehouse does not look quite as full. A tax demand feels harder to meet. A local official becomes more aggressive because the pressure above him has grown. A work crew arrives with less energy than before. The roads still function. The rituals still continue. The ruler is still named in the proper way. The monument still stands where it always stood. Yet somewhere beneath the visible surface, the system has started spending more strength than it can easily replace. That is why collapse can look so strange in hindsight. Later generations see the silence that followed and assume there must have been one dramatic cause. A civilization able to build pyramids, organize labor, move materials, and shape belief into stone seems too powerful to fade through small changes. Yet great systems are often most vulnerable to slow pressure because they are built on coordination. A simple village can survive with less order than an empire can. A household can adapt quickly. A large state has more moving parts. It depends on reliable seasons, transport, authority, storage, shared belief, and a social willingness to keep obeying the pattern. Once stress enters several of those layers at the same time, the center may continue to look strong even as its foundations begin to tire. In Egypt, the Nile long provided the rhythm that made central rule possible. Flooding watered the land and gave agriculture a degree of regularity rare in harsh climates. That rhythm helped build confidence. If the river rises, the fields respond. If the fields respond, grain can be collected. If grain can be collected, the state can feed labor, maintain order, support priests, fund projects, and display stability through architecture. But even a dependable river is not the same as an eternal promise. The relationship between flood, soil, and social order had to be renewed again and again. When flood levels became less favorable, whether too low or too erratic, pressure spread outward from the fields into every part of political life. A single poor season does not destroy a civilization. Most strong societies can absorb one bad year, sometimes several. The deeper danger comes when variation turns into pattern. If low floods return often enough, agricultural output shrinks. If output shrinks, the surplus that once felt abundant becomes strained. The state can still make demands, but those demands begin cutting closer to the bone. A system that once seemed generous enough to feed workers, fund rituals, and support provincial administration now has to choose more carefully. Every grain counted in a storehouse starts carrying more political weight than before. At that stage, the problem is no longer only environmental, it becomes administrative and emotional as well. People begin to feel the difference between a state that commands from strength and a state that commands from anxiety. That emotional shift may be one of the least visible but most important parts of civilizational decline. A society can endure hardship if people still trust that the system is broadly capable, broadly fair within its own historical terms, and still connected to a meaningful order. Hardship becomes more dangerous when trust weakens. A farmer asked to hand over grain during a difficult year may comply differently depending on whether he believes the state remains stable and protective, or whether he suspects the center is taking more because it is already slipping. In other words, shortage is not merely about material lack. It is about how people interpret the behavior of power under strain. This is one reason political fragmentation often begins quietly before it becomes obvious. In the later Old Kingdom and the period that followed, central authority in Egypt weakened relative to provincial power. Local officials, sometimes called nomarchs in modern discussions, became increasingly significant. This did not mean the civilizations suddenly ceased to function. Egyptian life continued. Agriculture continued. Religious practice continued. Yet the balance had shifted. Regional figures gained leverage. The center no longer held the same unquestioned command over the whole landscape. When power becomes more local, the ability to organize labor and resources on the older monumental scale grows weaker. The pyramid remains, but the machinery capable of repeating that achievement begins to dissolve into separate interests. One can almost imagine the change in practical terms. A command once issued from the center might now meet slower compliance in the provinces. A shipment delayed by local priorities stays delayed longer. A governor with growing prestige invests more in his own standing and less in the symbolic agenda of the distant ruler. Records still exist, but they reflect a looser structure. Loyalty becomes more negotiated. People continue to perform the old order because habit is powerful, but the old order no longer moves with the same smooth certainty. To later eyes, it can look as if a civilization fell. To those living through it, the process may have felt more like authority becoming less reliable, less unified, and less capable of turning belief into action at the old scale. Climate pressure can sharpen that process, but it rarely works alone. It is helpful to think of environmental stress not as a single hammer blow, but as a condition that exposes weakness in every connected system. Lower productivity means harder taxation. Harder taxation means more local tension. More tension means weaker loyalty. Weaker loyalty makes political enforcement costlier. Costlier enforcement strains resources further. In a centralized civilization, these effects do not stay where they begin. They travel. A bad flood is felt in the fields first, but eventually it appears in worker rations, temple endowments, transport planning, and public confidence. This pattern may also help explain why monumental building sometimes changes before the society fully breaks apart. When pressure rises, rulers often face a difficult choice. Do they preserve monumental display to maintain legitimacy, or do they redirect resources toward survival and local stability? In practice, many states try to do both. They keep the symbols alive because the symbols are part of how rule is justified. A king or dynasty does not want to announce weakness by abandoning the visible language of power. Yet maintaining grandeur under shrinking conditions can deepen strain. What once served as proof of order may gradually begin to function as a burden, especially if the gap grows between public display and private difficulty. This tension appears beyond Egypt as well. In the kingdom of Kush, pyramid building continued in a distinctive form for centuries, particularly at sites such as Nuri and Meroe. The endurance of that tradition shows that the form remained meaningful long after the earliest Egyptian pyramid age had passed. Yet Kush, too, depended on a broader political and economic world that could not remain unchanged forever. Trade routes shift. Regional rivals rise. Environmental conditions change. External pressures accumulate. A kingdom tied to long-distance exchange, sacred kingship, and elite display may continue projecting confidence while its strategic position grows more complicated. Meroe, in particular, offers a useful case. The city became a major center of Kushite power, known for royal burials, trade, and metal production. Its pyramids remain a striking testament to elite ambition and cultural continuity. Yet a kingdom built partly on controlling movement and exchange must adapt constantly to wider changes. If trade patterns begin to favor other routes, if neighboring powers become stronger, if ecological conditions around production and settlement grow less favorable, then royal symbolism alone cannot preserve political weight. The monuments continue standing, but the world that gave them immediate force becomes thinner. Over time, what once looked central begins to feel peripheral, and the shift may be gradual enough that no single generation fully names it as decline. The same slow pressure can be seen even more dramatically in Mesoamerica. There, many pyramid-building societies depended on delicate balances between agriculture, political legitimacy, and regional exchange. Teotihuacan, one of the great cities of the ancient world, rose through extraordinary planning and influence. Its broad avenues, monumental platforms, and carefully ordered urban design suggest a civilization with strong integrative power, but cities of that size do not persist by architecture alone. They require regular inflows of food, stable internal management, and a social system capable of holding very large populations together under shared meaning. If any of these begin to weaken, the scale that once made the city impressive also makes it harder to sustain. A large city is, in a sense, a promise that the countryside will keep feeding it. It is also a promise that internal social divisions will remain manageable. A city like Teotihuacan did not merely gather people. It gathered differences, elites and laborers, ritual specialists and craftsmen, traders and administrators, established households and newcomers, neighborhoods with distinct identities and shared obligations. While the system works, this complexity creates strength. It makes the city rich in skills, production, and cultural force. When strain rises, complexity can become fragility. Tensions that were once buffered by abundance become sharper under scarcity or political mistrust. Scholars still debate the precise causes behind Teotihuacan's decline, and the uncertainty itself is revealing. There is evidence of burning in some elite and ceremonial areas, which may suggest internal unrest rather than simple outside conquest. There are questions about changing trade patterns, ideological fracture, and stress within the ruling structure. What matters for the broader pattern is that the city's monumental form survived its political coherence. The Great Pyramids did not stop being physically impressive. What stopped was the shared civic life that had once animated the city on a massive scale. The center lost its grip before the stones lost their shape. The Maya world carries this lesson even further because its political landscape was never one single empire in the same way. It was a network of city-states, dynasties, alliances, rivalries, and shifting hierarchies spread across varied ecological zones. Many Maya centers built stepped pyramids as part of ceremonial and political life. These structures marked sacred time, royal authority, and public identity. Yet the same landscape that supported this brilliance could also become unforgiving under cumulative stress. Water storage, seasonal rainfall, soil management, forest use, and food production all mattered deeply. In parts of the southern lowlands, especially during the centuries associated with the classic Maya collapse, several pressures seem to have overlapped in ways that gradually weakened the old order. Drought is often the first explanation people reach for, and there is evidence that periods of reduced rainfall played an important role. But drought alone is too simple. Rainfall problems become most dangerous when they enter already demanding systems. A city that depends on reservoirs, managed landscapes, political tribute, and elite display can absorb a shortfall only if its institutions remain flexible and trusted. When drought coincides with warfare, dynastic competition, population pressure, and possibly ecological degradation from long-term land use, the effect becomes far more serious. What might have been manageable in one context becomes destructive in another because every system begins failing at once. Imagine a Maya center at the edge of stress. Reservoir levels are lower than usual. Crops are less reliable. The ruling dynasty still sponsors ceremonies, still raises monuments, still commemorates lineage and sacred timing because legitimacy depends on these performances. Rival polities remain active, so weakness cannot be admitted openly. Tribute or labor demands may continue because the elite structure cannot easily reduce itself without risking political collapse. Ordinary households, meanwhile, face increasing uncertainty. Food insecurity changes how families think. It changes loyalty. It changes willingness to remain close to the ceremonial center. People may migrate, reduce support for elite projects, or align themselves with more local and immediate forms of protection. The city is still there. Its temples still rise above the trees. Yet the social gravity holding everyone in place has weakened. This is where the question of overextension becomes especially important. Great civilizations often succeed by expanding their reach, intensifying production, and increasing the scale of display. That success can hide a trap. The more a system grows, the more it depends on precise coordination. Irrigation or water storage must work. Trade must keep moving. Peripheral communities must remain connected. Elites must manage rivalry without destroying the center. Ritual life must continue persuading people that the order remains meaningful. A smaller society can sometimes retreat, simplify, or localize its problems. A large ceremonial civilization built on visible greatness may find those adjustments harder because its identity is tied to scale. Pyramids embody that dilemma almost perfectly. They are symbols of coordination, but they can also reflect the cost of maintaining coordination. Building upward is one kind of achievement. Continuing to justify that upward effort across generations is another. A ruler who inherits monumental traditions does not inherit a blank slate. He inherits expectations. Subjects expect ritual. Priests expect support. Artisans expect patronage. The political class expects visible evidence that the center remains strong. Cutting back can look dangerous. Continuing can be expensive. The civilization begins to live inside obligations created by its own success. That does not mean pyramids themselves caused collapse. That would be too blunt and in many cases misleading. Monument building often worked because the society behind it was strong enough to support it. But monumental traditions can reveal a certain rigidity. They show that a civilization has learned to express power through large, durable forms. If the conditions beneath that expression begin to change, the symbolic habits may remain even when the material base is weakening. The result is not immediate ruin. It is a widening gap between what the civilization says about itself and what it can actually sustain. One of the clearest examples of this wider gap is the difference between monumental time and ecological time. A pyramid is designed to outlast generations. It belongs to an imagination of permanence. Ecological systems do not obey that imagination. Soil can tire, forests can thin, water patterns can shift, animal populations can change, river behavior can become less predictable. These processes do not care what a dynasty has carved in stone. A civilization that mistakes its symbolic endurance for ecological security begins making decisions under false confidence. It assumes that because the old order has lasted, the supporting landscape will continue responding in the old way. That assumption can hold for a very long time before it fails, which makes the failure all the more shocking. There is also a human tendency, present in many eras, to answer stress with more display rather than less. Under pressure, rulers often seek stronger symbols. Ceremonies grow more emphatic. Titles become grander. Monuments may continue, not because conditions are ideal, but because the need to signal control has become more urgent. This creates a tragic kind of momentum. The visible face of civilization becomes more important precisely when the invisible support systems are weakening. People living in or near the center may even interpret intensified display as evidence that all is well, while those closer to production and local hardship feel the strain more directly. Archaeology sometimes catches this mismatch in subtle ways. Monumental inscriptions may continue celebrating rulers and cosmic order, while household remains suggest nutritional stress, shifting settlement patterns, or reduced access to resources. Elite buildings may show investment even as ordinary dwellings change in size or density. Sacred sites may remain active while surrounding networks grow thinner. This is why collapse is rarely a clean line. Different parts of a civilization weaken at different speeds. The center often performs continuity longer than the countryside believes in it. Egypt's first intermediate period is a useful reminder that fragmentation does not equal total disappearance. Centralized royal power weakened, provincial elites became more independent, and the old unity of the Old Kingdom gave way to a looser political landscape. Yet Egyptian civilization did not end, it reconfigured. That distinction matters for all pyramid-building societies. The question is not always why they vanished in an absolute sense. Often the real question is why the form of civilization capable of sustaining certain monumental traditions could no longer hold itself together in the same way. Decline may mean decentralization, transformation, migration, or a redistribution of power rather than the complete erasure of a people. Still, from the perspective of a later observer standing among old monuments, that transformation can feel like disappearance. The crowd is gone. The state rituals no longer sound in the plaza. The old line of rulers has broken. The writing may no longer be read by the people who pass nearby. Trees or sand reclaim the edges of built space. The human field that once gave the architecture meaning has withdrawn. A city, burial ground, or ceremonial center can therefore appear abandoned, even when descendants of its builders still live elsewhere in new arrangements. The stones remain in their original place. The civilization has moved out of the form by which we first recognized it. This is especially true in the Maya region, where the phrase collapse can mislead if it is heard too absolutely. Many southern lowland centers declined sharply, but Maya civilization as a whole did not simply vanish. Northern centers later flourished. Maya communities endured and still endure. Language, culture, memory, and identity survived in changing forms. The monumental urban pattern shifted. Dynastic systems weakened in certain regions. Population redistributed. If one stands before a ruined pyramid in a forest, the silence invites thoughts of disappearance. The fuller truth is more complex and, in some ways, more human. People do not always cease to exist when states fail. They adapt, scatter, preserve, and transform. Even so, adaptation can be painful, and it often leaves old centers eerily still. A society, under long-term pressure, begins making smaller decisions that add up to large change. Households move closer to reliable water or better soils. Regional leaders prioritize local defense over loyalty to a distant capital. Artisans seek patronage in different places. Trade routes reroute. Sacred authority loses some of its ability to organize large populations around old ceremonial calendars. A few decades later, the result looks immense. The monumental center that once drew labor, goods, and devotion has become quieter than anyone previously imagined possible. The same may be said of Kush in its later centuries. The kingdom did not vanish in a single dramatic event. Its political and cultural position changed over time under the influence of regional shifts, trade reorientation, and external pressures, including interactions with Rome, and with rising powers in Northeast Africa. As these conditions evolved, the world in which Kushite pyramids expressed royal centrality became harder to sustain. Burial traditions persisted, but the kingdom's wider strategic force grew weaker. Once again, the monuments reveal both endurance and narrowing power. They survive as evidence of a civilization that once shaped its region far more strongly than its later obscurity might suggest. Across all of these cases, a pattern begins to emerge. The cracks form first in systems that feed, connect, and legitimize the center. Water grows less reliable. Soil or forest use becomes more demanding. Trade routes shift. Rival powers increase pressure. Provincial or local elites gain greater leverage. Households feel burdens more sharply. Ritual and monumental display continue, sometimes even intensify, because the civilization still speaks through its old symbols. But symbols cannot carry the full weight forever. When too many pressures converge, the great built forms begin outlasting the social order that once kept them alive. There is something quietly sobering in that. A pyramid can seem like the opposite of fragility. It is stone on a scale that resists weather, resists time, resists the frailty of human life. Yet the civilization that built it may have been fragile in exactly the places the monument hides best. Food systems, climate balance, trust in authority, local compliance, political flexibility, and the ability to change without losing legitimacy. The stronger the appearance of permanence, the easier it may have been for people inside the system to overlook how much they depended on conditions beyond their direct control. That is why the beginning of decline rarely feels like the beginning of decline. It feels like inconvenience, difficulty, tightening, adjustment, maybe a few bad years, maybe tension in the provinces, maybe an unfamiliar edge in old obligations. Great civilizations do not wake up one morning and call themselves collapsing. They continue, they insist, they perform continuity. The workers still haul, the priests still chant. The rulers still claim favor, the farmers still sow in hope. Yet the arithmetic beneath the grandeur has changed, and once it changes enough, every effort to preserve the old form becomes harder. By the time the cracks are visible from a distance, the real damage has often already been done in quieter places, in storage rooms where supplies came up short, in villages where families left, in councils where loyalty thinned, in fields where the old certainty of the seasons no longer felt so certain. The pyramid remains what it always was to the eye, but not to history. What once stood as proof of a civilization's power begins, slowly, to stand as proof that power had limits after all. And once those limits are exposed, the pressure no longer stays hidden in the walls. It moves outward into politics, conflict, and the long approach of silence. When decline becomes visible, people are often tempted to imagine that visibility as the true beginning of collapse. Smoke rises from part of a city. Trade stops moving with the same regularity. A royal line breaks. A ceremonial center falls quiet. A once powerful capital loses its hold, and later observers point to that moment as the turning point. Yet by the time a civilization reaches that stage, much of the work has already been done by smaller pressures accumulating in the dark. The visible collapse is not always the first wound. It is often the moment when hidden weaknesses finally lose their ability to stay hidden. Still, visible collapse matters because it changes how a society feels to those inside it. Shortage is one thing. Political fragmentation is another. Open conflict, abandoned neighborhoods, damaged ceremonial buildings, rival claims to authority, and the breakdown of ordinary confidence create a different atmosphere altogether. A person living through such a period no longer experiences strain as an inconvenience or an adjustment. The old order begins to feel breakable. That emotional shift may be as important as any material event. Once a civilization is seen as vulnerable, people stop orienting themselves toward permanence and begin orienting themselves toward survival, local loyalty, or flight. This stage is especially important for understanding pyramid-building civilizations because their monumental centers were often designed to project exactly the opposite impression. A pyramid says stability. A processional avenue says order. A temple platform says sacred connection between rulers and cosmic power. These places were built to gather people into a meaningful public world. When they begin to empty, burn, crack, or lose their ritual force, the loss is not merely political, it is psychological. The architecture still stands, but it no longer commands the same trust. A society built partly through visible symbols of permanence begins to experience those symbols as reminders of something it can no longer fully maintain. In Egypt, the weakening of the Old Kingdom did not look like a single catastrophic fall. It unfolded through a changing relationship between central authority and regional power. Yet even in a civilization as remarkably durable as Egypt, moments of political fragmentation carried a real sense of danger. During the First Intermediate Period, the unified image of strong kingship gave way to competing centers and local rulers whose authority carried greater practical weight than the distant ideal of royal control. That does not mean the land dissolved into complete disorder everywhere at once. Egyptian life continued in farms, towns, temples, and river traffic. But the symbolic center no longer held the same unquestioned power over the whole social field. One can imagine the change in everyday terms. A command from the center, once treated as natural and binding, now travels through layers of local interest. Provincial elites build their own prestige more openly. Loyalty shifts from abstract unity toward nearby power. Burial practices, inscriptions, and local projects begin reflecting stronger regional identity. The old pyramid age, with its concentrated ability to mobilize labor on a scale like Giza, belongs to a different political atmosphere than this one. The monuments remain. The coherence that made them possible no longer exists in the same form. That is one kind of silence. Not total abandonment, but the fading of a central voice that once organized the whole landscape. Conflict, in such settings, does not always begin with grand military conquest. It can begin as competition among elites. When central power weakens, ambitious regional figures do not need to declare rebellion in the modern sense. They may simply act more independently, keep more resources close to home, strengthen local networks, and invest less in the symbolic program of the broader state. Over time, these choices harden into rival political worlds. Even if they share language, religion, and inherited culture, they stop behaving as a single order. A civilization still exists, but the form in which it once concentrated power has broken. That distinction matters because collapse is often too blunt a word. It can suggest that everything ends at once. In many cases, what collapses first is a particular political arrangement. People remain, skills remain, rituals adapt, local traditions continue, but the large integrated order that could command monumental projects and hold broad territories together loses its shape. To someone standing later among pyramids, this can look like disappearance, especially if the old royal system is gone. Yet to those living through it, it may have felt more like the world becoming fragmented, less predictable, and less centered than before. The Kingdom of Kush offers another version of this process. At its height, Kush was a formidable power, drawing strength from the Nile corridor, regional trade, military capacity, sacred kingship, and its own deep traditions of rulership. Its pyramids, particularly those at Meroe, stand today as clear signs of royal confidence and continuity. Yet Kush's position depended not only on burial custom, but on political relevance within a shifting regional map. As neighboring powers changed, as trade patterns evolved, and as external pressures accumulated, the kingdom's ability to sustain old forms of centrality weakened. Royal symbols did not disappear immediately. They persisted, but persistence of symbolism is not the same as persistence of power. This is where conflict becomes especially revealing. Civilizations under long pressure often face not one enemy, but a field of pressures moving at different speeds. A stronger neighbor tests borders. Trade routes drift away. Internal factions grow less patient. Peripheral zones become harder to hold. Resources needed to support the center become less secure. A kingdom may answer by intensifying royal display, reorganizing military effort, or leaning more heavily on old symbols of legitimacy. These responses can buy time. They cannot always reverse the deeper movement. When enough parts of the system begin favoring local survival or alternative centers of power, the great state starts narrowing inward. One of the most moving features of late monumental civilizations is that the architecture often remains active while authority is thinning. Temples still receive ritual. Royal burials continue. Elite forms survive. Outsiders or later generations can mistake that continuity for full strength. But the real question is how wide the supporting field still is. Are local communities still invested? Are distant routes still feeding wealth inward? Are rival powers being contained? Are the institutions beneath the ceremonial surface still resilient? If the answer to enough of those questions begins turning toward no, then the civilization is entering a dangerous stage, even if the monuments still gleam in the sun. Teotihuacan gives us one of the most striking examples of visible collapse in a pyramid-centered civilization. At its height, it was one of the largest cities on Earth, a carefully planned urban world of extraordinary scale. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Great Avenue cutting through the city, residential compounds, workshop areas, and ritual centers all communicated enormous social power. To stand inside that city, in its prime, would have been to experience a civilization that seemed ordered beyond ordinary expectation. Yet the city's decline appears to have involved not only long-term stress, but direct conflict and disruption within the urban core itself. Evidence of burning in elite and ceremonial areas has led many scholars to consider the possibility of internal unrest, perhaps even a revolt or targeted destruction by groups within the city. That detail is important. It suggests that collapse did not necessarily come only from outside invasion. A monumental city can carry internal tensions for a long time. Class divisions, ideological fracture, competing elites, strained supplies, and weakening legitimacy can all remain partly hidden while the architectural shell continues presenting unity. When those tensions finally break the surface, the center itself may become a battlefield of meaning. Burning a ceremonial or elite structure is not only an act of destruction, it is an assault on the symbols through which the city understood itself. Imagine what such a moment would feel like to a resident of Teotihuacan. The Great Pyramids still dominate the skyline. The avenues still direct movement. The city still bears the shape of a civilization that once seemed meant to endure. Yet parts of the ceremonial core are damaged. Trust between groups has thinned. The old ideology no longer gathers people in the same way. Perhaps neighborhoods become more self-protective. Perhaps trade no longer supplies the city with the same reliability. Perhaps the rulers, if the system had identifiable rulers in the way later societies did, no longer command reverence strong enough to hold competing interests together. At that point, abandonment does not need to be ordered. It can emerge from a collective shift in confidence. People simply stop committing themselves to the center as they once did. That kind of withdrawal produces a particular sort of silence. A city does not need to be massacred to become quiet. It can empty through attrition. Families leave. Workshops slow. Ritual attendance thins. Maintenance declines. Public spaces feel less central to life. The monumental core remains physically where it was, but it loses its power to pull society inward. Over time, the silence deepens, not because no one remembers the place, but because its role has changed from living center to inherited shell. Later peoples may still revere it, reinterpret it, or tell stories about it. Yet the civilization that produced its original political and ceremonial life has already moved elsewhere or dissolved into other arrangements. The Maya world reveals this process with even more variation. Many classic Maya cities experienced decline, conflict, and abandonment, but not all in the same way or at the same time. Some centers show signs of warfare, fortification, dynastic struggle, or sudden interruption of elite building programs. Others seem to have thinned more gradually. Monument inscriptions stop. Construction slows. Populations decline. Sacred and political life narrows. The silence of a ruined Maya site can therefore represent many kinds of ending at once: military defeat, ecological stress, dynastic failure, migration, loss of legitimacy, or the simple draining away of enough people to make the old urban form impossible to sustain. Warfare seems to have intensified in parts of the later classic Maya period. Rival city-states competed for prestige, captives, territory, and dynastic advantage. In periods of strain, warfare does not merely add violence, it multiplies instability. Fields can be disrupted. Trade becomes riskier. Alliances grow brittle. Rulers may respond to insecurity by demanding more from their populations in order to fund defense or display strength. The burden on ordinary households increases. If drought or food pressure is already present, warfare can tip a difficult situation into a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and depletion. A dynasty loses a battle, or a key ruler is captured, and the political meaning of the city begins to unravel. Dynastic breakage mattered deeply in Maya civilization because kingship was not only administrative, it was sacred, ancestral, and performative. A ruler stood within a lineage that connected present authority to past legitimacy and ritual time. When that line fractured, the city did not merely lose an official. It lost a piece of the story that held power together. Pyramid temples, plazas, monuments, and inscriptions all participated in this story. If the ruler is defeated, if the line ends, or if the city can no longer convincingly stage its place in sacred history, architecture alone cannot keep the political world alive. The city begins to hollow from the top. It is possible to imagine one of these cities in its late phase. The pyramid still rises above the plaza. The stone carvings still speak of victories and ancestors. But the confidence once carried by those messages has begun to thin. Local people notice shortages. Rival powers press from nearby. Water is harder to secure. Fields yield less or require more effort. The ruler still performs, still invokes legitimacy, still tries to maintain the rhythm of ceremony. But each performance must now work harder to produce the same effect. Public life becomes strained theater. Then one day the ceremony stops, or the court grows smaller, or the plaza no longer fills as it once did. Silence enters before abandonment is complete. The city begins sounding empty even while some people still remain. One of the hardest questions in the study of collapse is why some sites were abandoned more fully than others. Why does one city empty while another adapts? Why does one kingdom fragment into successor centers while another loses visibility more completely? There is no single answer, but geography, resource access, political flexibility, trade position, leadership quality, and simple timing all matter. A city with better water control, stronger regional ties, or a less brittle elite structure may survive longer. Another, equally impressive in architecture, may fail because several stresses converge there more sharply. The physical grandeur of a site does not guarantee resilience. Sometimes it reflects how dependent the site was on exact conditions that later slipped away. This helps explain why later silence can feel so uneven. Some pyramid sites remain in places where descendants continued living nearby, farming nearby, or preserving cultural memory even if the old ceremonial order was gone. Others stand farther from dense later settlement and seem more starkly isolated. Some were reused by later cultures. Some were looted, stripped, or reinterpreted. The silence we perceive is shaped partly by ancient abandonment and partly by everything that happened afterward. A site that feels empty today may once have remained meaningful for centuries after its political peak, just in different ways. There is also the role of external conquest, though it should be handled carefully. Outsiders can absolutely contribute to collapse. In some contexts, invasion, military pressure, or imperial absorption can accelerate a decline already underway. Yet conquest usually succeeds most easily, where internal resilience has weakened. A strong, adaptive civilization can repel or absorb shocks that would destroy a brittle one. This is why external causes are rarely sufficient by themselves. When Rome pressured Kush, for example, it entered a world already shaped by broader regional dynamics. When later outsiders encountered fragmented Mesoamerican landscapes, they did not create every weakness from nothing. They often arrived in systems where rivalries, burdens, and historical fractures already existed. Still, conquest can produce a finality that long decline alone does not. A people may survive fragmentation, drought, and shifting trade for centuries. A decisive military defeat or absorption into a larger imperial structure can end the old state form more clearly. Yet even here, disappearance is often deceptive. Political sovereignty may end while population, memory, and cultural practice continue. A dynasty falls, a capital loses autonomy. Royal pyramids cease to function as current symbols of power. Later generations inherit the people, but not the state that once made those monuments central. The silence of the site deepens because no living authority still speaks through it in the same name. Another force in this stage of collapse is abandonment by neglect rather than by decision. Monumental centers require maintenance. Plaster must be repaired. Stairways must be cleared. Ritual spaces must be cleaned and renewed. Drainage must function. Structures left untended begin changing immediately, though the change may be slow to the eye. Plants take hold. Water enters small cracks. Loose stone shifts. Walls lose definition. A city that still has some population but no longer commands collective maintenance can begin looking aged very quickly. The contrast between the intended permanence of the architecture and the visible signs of neglect can be powerful. It tells us that the community, once capable of constant care, has thinned or redirected itself elsewhere. This kind of neglect is not trivial. It is political evidence. A civilization maintains what it still believes to be central. When maintenance falters at major ceremonial or royal sites, it suggests not only shortage, but a change in priority. People may no longer feel obliged, able, or willing to pour labor into the old center. Their world has narrowed or shifted. Perhaps a smaller local shrine matters more now than a distant pyramid. Perhaps a fortified settlement is more important than a ceremonial avenue. Perhaps feeding children through a hard season takes precedence over preserving elite architecture whose authority has become abstract. These are the kinds of decisions through which silence takes root. Silence itself is worth lingering on because it is not only the absence of noise. At an abandoned pyramid site, silence means missing routines. No work crews, no processions, no public feasts. No offerings carried upward on a fixed calendar. No official voices giving shape to sacred time. No craftsmen hurrying to complete repairs before a ceremony. No provincial envoys arriving with goods. No laborers sleeping in nearby quarters before another day of effort. The monument becomes detached from the rhythm that gave it emotional force. It survives, but now it survives as a remainder. Later visitors often respond to such places with awe, and understandably so. Yet awe can flatten history if it imagines abandonment as a neat final act. In truth, many monumental centers pass through long periods of thinning use. Some districts emptied first. Some rituals continued in reduced form. Some elites clung to inherited symbols after their social base had narrowed. Some local groups repurposed old spaces even after dynastic life had ended. The silence we imagine as sudden was often layered and gradual. It deepened over generations until the old civilization no longer occupied the center in the way it once had. There is something almost tragic in the mismatch between the monument's promise and the society's fate. A pyramid is one of the most deliberate statements a civilization can make against time. It says we can impose order that lasts. We can shape matter into memory. We can anchor authority beyond one lifetime. And for a while, that statement is true. The problem is not that the pyramid fails as stone. The problem is that the society behind it remains vulnerable to all the things stone cannot solve. Drought, faction, burden, mistrust, rivalry, shifting trade, local resentment, ecological strain, and the slow hardening of old institutions into something less flexible than the world around them. This vulnerability can even be intensified by the civilization's own success. The greater the monument, the greater the expectations that accompany it. A people accustomed to visible greatness may struggle more to adjust to contraction. Elites shaped by ceremonial display may respond poorly to scarcity. Rulers who inherit sacred architecture may feel compelled to continue the outward performance of stability even when their real capacity is shrinking. Subjects may interpret any reduction in ritual or public magnificence as evidence of weakening, which in turn makes rulers cling harder to display. Thus, collapse can be delayed in one sense, but deepened in another. The forms remain longer. The flexibility needed to survive may diminish. Across Egypt, Kush, Teotihuacan, and the Maya world, the pattern remains varied but familiar. Conflict grows sharper when strain has already thinned the base of trust. Political power fragments, or narrows. The ceremonial center begins losing its hold. Some sites burn, some are neglected, some are gradually emptied, some are overshadowed by new centers, and some remain as sacred or cultural references long after their original civic life has ended. Not all endings look the same. Some are loud, others quiet. Some leave clear signs of violence, others mostly signs of withdrawal. Some states fall while their people continue nearby. Others fade into history's later powers only half remember. And perhaps that is why abandoned pyramids feel so heavy. They do not merely show us that a civilization once existed. They show us that the civilization once believed enough in its own permanence to build upward on a massive scale, only to discover that human order has limits no geometry can erase. The silence around such places is therefore not empty in the ordinary sense. It is crowded with the absence of coordination, belief, labor, and daily repetition. One can almost sense how many hands were once required just to keep the place alive, and how many of those hands had to stop for the silence to take hold. By the time a monumental center reaches that stage, the collapse is no longer theoretical. It is lived. Children grow up with fewer memories of the old ceremonies. Roads become less traveled. Nearby communities speak of the center with more distance. Political life reorganizes around other places, other leaders, other scales of belonging. The pyramid still catches the light, but fewer eyes are turned toward it with the old understanding. It begins the long transition from active symbol to inherited mystery. That transition is never only about destruction. It is also about what survives after the center falls quiet. People carry customs away, languages persist, ritual ideas change form. Memories are retold, simplified, mythologized, or attached to new powers. Some descendants remain close by, others move into different political worlds. The civilization that seems absent from the monument may still be present in transformed ways beyond it. Yet from the standpoint of the old center, it is hard not to feel the loss. The place was built to gather human meaning upward. Now the meaning has dispersed. The order that once rose in stone has entered its long afterlife, and what remains is not only the evidence of greatness, but the proof that greatness could not keep the center alive forever. Once that much has been lost, the question changes. It is no longer only how the collapse happened, or why conflict sharpened when it did. The harder question is what vanished really means. When the stones remain, the descendants may remain, and yet the civilization in its old recognizable form is gone. The answer lies somewhere between disappearance and transformation, and to see it clearly, we have to look beyond the silence itself and into the strange, unfinished afterlife that monumental civilizations leave behind. When people stand before an ancient pyramid now, they often feel they are looking at the remains of something finished. The civilization is gone, the rulers are gone, the ceremonies are gone. The crowds that once moved around the structure have vanished into a silence so complete that it can feel almost natural, as if the site had always belonged to stillness. That feeling is understandable, but it can also be misleading. Civilizations do not always disappear in the clean, absolute way that ruins encourage us to imagine. Sometimes what vanishes is not the people themselves, but the political shape that once gathered them. Sometimes what is lost is not memory, but continuity of power. Sometimes what remains is far more than stone, though stone is the part most willing to wait. That is why the question in this final movement is not simply why these pyramid-building civilizations vanished. By now, the deeper question is what vanished really means. Did the people disappear? Did their culture end? Did their descendants abandon everything and become something else entirely? Or did the monumental civilization, the state form capable of organizing belief, labor, ritual, and authority at a massive scale, break apart while many older strands survived in altered ways? Once we ask the question that way, the ruins begin to look different. They are no longer only evidence of endings. They are evidence of transformation, interruption, survival, and long shadows that outlast the powers that first cast them. Egypt offers perhaps the clearest example of why disappearance must be handled carefully. The civilization that built the Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom did not simply fall into nothingness. Egyptian culture endured for millennia after the age of Khufu and Khafre. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals shifted, foreign powers entered, religious practices evolved, burial customs changed. Temples grew in importance in different periods. Royal tomb architecture moved away from the Great Pyramid form. Yet Egypt did not vanish in the simple sense. What vanished was a particular arrangement of kingship, economy, sacred symbolism, and centralized confidence that made the giant pyramid age possible. The monument remained. The civilization continued, but not in the same shape. This distinction is vital because it helps us escape one of the most common traps in thinking about the ancient world. We often treat a civilization as though it were identical to its most famous form. In Egypt's case, that means the Pyramid Age can seem like the entire civilization in miniature. But the people living along the Nile after the Old Kingdom were not walking through the ruins of a dead people in the way modern tourists do. They were inheritors of a long and changing tradition. They knew the monuments as part of their own deep past, even as they built differently, ruled differently, and imagined royal eternity through new means. So what was lost was not Egypt itself, but a specific old confidence and a specific monumental language. Something similar can be said of Kush, though its place in broader public memory has been far less secure. The kingdom that built the Nubian pyramids at sites like Nuri and Meroe left behind unmistakable evidence of royal ambition and sacred authority. Yet later histories, especially those shaped by outside attention, often narrowed Kush into a footnote beside Egypt, as though its monuments existed in the shadow of someone else's story. This is one way civilizations can seem to vanish even when their remains are substantial. They can be pushed to the edge of later memory. Their achievements survive physically while their place in the larger narrative grows dimmer. That dimming is a kind of loss in itself. A civilization does not vanish only through political decline. It can also fade through neglect, reinterpretation, or unequal remembrance. Kush once controlled territory, trade, and military power significant enough to shape Northeast Africa. Its rulers adopted, adapted, and transformed forms of kingship and monumental burial in ways that reveal a creative political world, not a passive one. Yet many modern people know the Egyptian pyramids instantly and the Nubian pyramids hardly at all. The stones survive. The historical attention does not survive equally. In that sense, the afterlife of a civilization is shaped not only by what happened in antiquity, but by what later ages choose to notice. Mesoamerica shows this tension even more vividly because the idea of disappearance has often been imposed from the outside with great force. Take the Maya. For generations, popular culture spoke of the Maya as a vanished people, a lost civilization swallowed by the forest. Yet the Maya did not vanish. Maya communities endured. Maya languages endured and still endure. Maya identities endured under changing political realities, including the devastating disruptions of colonialism. What declined were certain classic period urban centers and dynastic systems, especially in parts of the southern lowlands. The monumental cities fell quiet. The political worlds that had filled those plazas changed or fractured, but the people did not evaporate into the trees. The difference between a vanished state and a surviving people matters deeply. When a city empties, later viewers are tempted to imagine a total ending because the architecture seems to demand one. A great stepped pyramid rising above an empty plaza feels like a dramatic final image, but real human history is usually messier than the image. Populations move, power relocates, ritual life changes, scale. New centers rise elsewhere. Descendants keep speaking, farming, marrying, remembering, and adapting under altered conditions. The old site may become less central, or sacred in a different way, or even half forgotten by some and cherished by others. The monumental center loses its original role, but life continues beyond its frame. Teotihuacan presents a slightly different case because its decline left fewer direct threads of institutional continuity that can be followed in the same way as Egypt's dynastic succession or Maya cultural survival. Yet even there, the city did not vanish into absolute emptiness the moment its central political order broke down. Later peoples encountered it, interpreted it, and folded it into their own sacred understanding. The city became a place of inherited awe. That kind of afterlife is significant. A civilization may lose its original civic life, but its monumental landscape can remain active in the imagination of those who come later. Ruins are not always dead spaces. They can become powerful containers for new stories, new rituals, and new claims of legitimacy. This helps explain why pyramids survive so well in cultural memory even when the civilizations that built them have changed beyond recognition. A pyramid is not easy to ignore. Its shape is too deliberate, too visible, too resistant to erasure. Even looted, broken, weathered, or surrounded by different peoples than those who first built it, a pyramid insists on interpretation. It asks to be explained. If later generations do not possess the original explanation, they create another one. In this way, monumental architecture can outlive the exact meaning that gave birth to it and enter a second or third life as myth, symbol, warning, or sacred inheritance. Yet this survival through reinterpretation also tells us something sad. What remains is often the outline of meaning rather than meaning itself. The builders knew why the structure stood where it stood. They knew which rituals belonged there, which names should be spoken, which offerings mattered, which ancestors were being invoked, which cosmic ideas the geometry or orientation might reflect. Later people may sense the weight of the site without having access to that whole world of understanding. The stones remain visible. The inner certainty that once animated them becomes harder to recover. Archaeology can recover part of that lost world, but never all of it. Inscriptions help where they survive. Burials reveal status, diet, illness, and craft. Pottery traces trade and chronology. Settlement patterns show movement and contraction. Environmental data can reveal drought, erosion, flood change, or forest use. Human bones reveal stress, labor, and diet. Yet evidence is uneven. Some things preserve beautifully, while others disappear almost completely. A great civilization may have produced endless speech, argument, instruction, prayer, and ordinary conversation. And almost none of that sound survives. What survives are fragments, patterns, materials, the durable outer skin of a much larger life. This is why ruins can create a false sense of certainty. They appear solid. They look as though they should tell a complete story because they are so physically present. But presence is not the same as completeness. A pyramid may survive, while the food systems that supported its construction leave only indirect traces. A royal tomb may preserve objects, while the social tensions surrounding the ruler vanish from direct view. A city plan may survive, while the emotional life of the people who walked it remains largely invisible. What remains, then, is not simply enough. It is enough to make us wonder, enough to reconstruct part of the past, enough to see greatness and fragility together, but not enough to erase uncertainty. And uncertainty should not be treated as failure. In some ways, it is the most honest part of this history. The reason no single explanation fully satisfies the question of why pyramid-building civilizations vanished is that vanish compresses too much human experience into one dramatic word. Civilizations change unevenly. Regions respond differently. Elites and farmers experience the same crisis in different ways. One city empties while another adapts. One dynasty collapses while local traditions survive. One ritual system ends while a language continues. The old monumental order may disappear from public life long before the descendants of its builders disappear from the land. This is particularly important in discussing the Maya, but it reaches beyond them. The concept of collapse is useful only if it is handled with care. Collapse can describe the breakdown of a certain political or urban form. It should not automatically imply the disappearance of a people. The same caution applies, in different ways, to other ancient societies. Kush lost political prominence, but the lands it shaped did not become blank. Egypt's old kingdom ended, but Egyptian civilization continued in transformed forms. Teotihuacan's civic core fell quiet, but its monumental presence lived on in the sacred imagination of later Central Mexican societies. The past is full of endings that are not absolute, and survivals that do not look like victory. If we return to the pyramids themselves, they begin to seem almost like traps for the modern imagination. They are so permanent that they invite us to think in absolutes. Either the civilization lasted or it failed. Either the people remained or they vanished. Either the purpose is known or it is mysterious. But human history rarely obeys that kind of clean divide. A pyramid can stand in a region where descendants still live, speak related languages, farm related land, and carry altered but real cultural memory. At the same time, the specific state that ordered the pyramid's construction may be gone beyond recovery. Both things can be true. Presence and absence can occupy the same landscape. There is also the matter of what was emotionally lost when these civilizations changed. We often speak of loss in terms of institutions, populations, and architecture, but something more intimate vanished too. Entire ways of understanding time disappeared or transformed. Ritual calendars that once organized the year faded or shifted. Official stories linking rulers to gods lost their authority. Shared habits of movement through ceremonial spaces ended. The meaning of labor changed. A person living during the height of a pyramid-building state knew where power stood, where sacred action happened, where the center of the world seemed to be. When that order weakens, people do not lose only buildings. They lose orientation. That loss of orientation can be one of the deepest consequences of civilizational change. It is not as visible as a burned temple or an abandoned palace, but it runs through everything. A father explaining the world to his child can no longer assume the same certainties. A local ritual may continue, but without the same confidence that it connects upward into a stable political cosmos. A ruler may still perform authority, but the performance lands differently when too many people have begun doubting the center. Communities start inventing or accepting new ways to place themselves in time. Some hold tightly to inherited forms. Others shift more quickly. Over generations, the old order is no longer felt from the inside. It becomes history, memory, or legend. Legend itself is one of the strange residues that remain when civilization changes. Later peoples often inherit monumental sites without inheriting the full practical knowledge that made them. As a result, ruins become fertile ground for stories. The site was built by giants. The place belongs to gods. The city was abandoned because of a curse. The temple stands where creation began. These are not mere errors in the childish sense. They are acts of cultural repair. When formal continuity is broken, imagination steps in to bridge the gap between visible greatness and missing explanation. In this way, the afterlife of a pyramid may be sacred even when its original ritual system is gone. There is something moving in that. Human beings rarely leave powerful places uninterpreted. We cannot bear the combination of grandeur and silence without adding meaning. Later, Mesoamerican peoples looked at Teotihuacan and treated it as a place of deep significance. Ancient Egyptian monuments were reused, restored, admired, and recontextualized in later periods within Egypt itself and by outsiders who came after. Nubian monuments, too, passed through changing fields of attention and neglect. The site persists, meaning changes hands. A civilization vanishes in one sense and survives in another, not because its institutions remain intact, but because its material world continues provoking human response. Modern archaeology and history have complicated this picture in valuable ways. They have challenged old colonial ideas that treated non-European ruins as evidence of total disappearance or mysterious decline without descendants. They have emphasized continuity where older narratives saw only loss. They have restored attention to civilizations such as Kush that were long pushed to the margins. They have shown that environmental stress, warfare, political fragmentation, adaptation, and survival can coexist within the same story. This matters not only for accuracy, but for respect. To speak too casually of vanished civilizations is sometimes to erase the people who survived them. And yet we should not swing too far in the opposite direction and pretend that nothing was lost. Something enormous was lost. Entire urban worlds ceased functioning. Dynastic records ended. Sacred centers fell quiet. Administrative systems dissolved. Artistic programs stopped or changed beyond recognition. Technical knowledge tied to specific institutions may have narrowed or disappeared. Long-range political coherence broke apart. If descendants survived, they did so under altered conditions, sometimes harshly altered, sometimes under pressures and inequalities not chosen by them. Survival is real. Loss is real too. The challenge is to hold both together, without flattening one into the other. Perhaps the clearest way to say it is this: the pyramids remain, but not the exact worlds that made them. The geometry survives. The labor system does not survive in its original form. The ceremonial platforms survive. The voices that filled them do not survive in full. The burial chambers survive. The beliefs that structured their use survive only partly, unevenly, or in transformed descendants. The state's confidence survives as architecture, but not as living political fact. In this sense, pyramids are among the most honest monuments ever built. They preserve both triumph and limit at the same time. They show what human beings can organize when belief, power, labor, and environment line up strongly enough. They also show that no amount of stone can guarantee the continuation of that alignment. This may be why pyramid sites feel so emotionally dense, even to people with little formal knowledge of the culture that built them. Something in us recognizes the contradiction. We are looking at permanence created by beings who were not permanent. We are looking at certainty expressed by societies that could not remain certain forever. We are looking at public confidence after the public that shared it has dispersed. The monument is both success and warning. It tells us that civilizations can reach astonishing levels of coordination. It also tells us that coordination is one of the most fragile achievements in human life. The phrase "forgotten civilization" therefore needs care. No civilization is forgotten in the same way by everyone. Some are forgotten by empires that replace them. Some are forgotten by school systems that prefer simpler stories. Some are forgotten in one language and remembered in another. Some remain deeply present to descendant communities while being treated as mysterious or lost by outsiders. The pyramids do not belong equally to all acts of memory. They sit inside ongoing arguments over heritage, ownership, scholarship, and historical attention. What remains is not just ancient stone. It is also the modern struggle over how the past is named and who gets to speak for it. This matters especially when modern visitors treat ruins as though they belong entirely to the dead. In many cases, they do not. They belong to living histories. Descendant communities may still hold knowledge, claims, emotional connection, or political stakes in those places. Even when direct ritual continuity has broken, the site may remain part of a people's long sense of itself. To speak of disappearance too casually can therefore repeat the older violence of erasure. It can turn living descendants into accidental spectators to their own past. A pyramid may look silent to the visitor, yet still resonate within living identity in ways the visitor does not hear. At the same time, there are moments when silence really is silence, at least in the sense that too much has been broken to restore continuity fully. Languages die, scripts go unread for centuries. Populations are displaced. Colonial destruction, looting, neglect, and modern development can widen the gap between site and community. Museums scatter objects far from their original context. Tourist economies reshape how ruins are encountered. Even preservation changes a site's life, freezing it into a controlled heritage space rather than a living place within local rhythms. The afterlife of monumental civilizations is therefore not only ancient, it continues now, shaped by modern power as much as old stone. All of this brings us back to the core promise of the title. Why did they vanish? The fullest answer is that they often did not vanish all at once, and they often did not vanish entirely. They weakened, fragmented, adapted, moved, were conquered, were remembered unevenly, were reinterpreted, and sometimes survived through descendants whose continuity outsiders failed to recognize. The pyramid-building civilization in its most recognizable monumental form may have disappeared. The people, the memory, the cultural fragments, or the later transformations often did not. The vanishing was real, but it was rarely simple. If we wanted a single image for that truth, it might be this: a pyramid at dusk, with no ceremony taking place. The structure is intact enough to show intention. The plaza below is quiet. The ruling line that once made the place central has ended or changed beyond recognition. The rituals are no longer what they were. Yet the site is not nothing. It still stands in relation to land, weather, memory, and later human eyes. It has passed out of one historical life and into another. That second life may be made of archaeology, tourism, legend, scholarly debate, descendant identity, or political struggle over heritage. The civilization did not simply end and leave a blank. It left an unfinished conversation. In that sense, what remains is not only stone, but a question carried forward across centuries. How does a society powerful enough to build upward on that scale lose the exact form of life that made such building possible? The answer lives partly in climate, partly in war, partly in political fragmentation, partly in overextension, partly in the burden of maintaining legitimacy under strain. But the answer also lives in the ordinary truth that no civilization, however confident, can completely control the future it is building toward. Every pyramid was an argument against forgetting. Every abandoned or transformed pyramid is also proof that memory changes shape. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson these monuments offer. Human beings want permanence, and they keep reaching for it in whatever materials their world allows. Stone, ritual, kingship, sacred geometry. Public labor. They build as if order can be fixed in place. For a while, it can. For a remarkable while, sometimes. But the life that surrounds the stone keeps moving. Rivers shift, trade reroutes, dynasties weaken, forests thicken, droughts return, cities burn, communities migrate, conquerors arrive, descendants reinterpret, languages transform, and memory itself selects, forgets, and restores unevenly. The monument endures. The civilization flows around it into forms the builders could not fully imagine. So the forgotten civilization that built pyramids did not usually vanish in the way a story vanishes when the final page is turned. It vanished more like a voice, fading into distance, while parts of the song remained. Some notes were lost, some were carried forward, some were mistaken for silence because the listener no longer knew the tune. The pyramid stayed behind like the held final chord, still audible long after the singers had changed or gone. And perhaps that is why they continue to pull at us. Not because they are only mysterious, and not because they belong to some simple tale of rise and fall, but because they allow us to see both the brilliance and the limit of civilization at once. They were built by people who believed their order meant something lasting. They were right, and they were wrong. The stone lasted. The exact world that raised it did not. What remains is enough to humble us, enough to move us, and enough to remind us that disappearance is rarely pure absence. More often, it is transformation seen from too far away.